He thought his badge made him untouchable, until he brought the wrong woman to court. Officer Brent Henson wasn't born into power, but once he wore the badge, it clung to him like a second skin, armor against consequence, a license to dominate. In his precinct, he was seen as a rising star, the kind of cop who made arrests like clockwork and never questioned orders. But beneath the facade of discipline and honor was a man who equated authority with control. Over a decade in the force, Henson had built an unspoken reputation. Efficient on paper, untouchable in practice. He worked the neighborhoods most people avoided, and in doing so mastered the subtle art of coercion. He knew the system's blind spots, where cameras failed, where supervisors looked away, where paperwork could be massaged to fit a narrative. In his world, victims were suspects and suspects were threats, and threats deserved to be silenced. He could twist a traffic stop into a drug charge, spin resistance into assault. Complaints against him vanished into files marked unsubstantiated. Those who dared speak up often found themselves arrested again, sometimes even evicted, their lives quietly dismantled by a man who knew how to manipulate not just the law, but the silence around it. Henson thrived in that silence. He cultivated relationships with prosecutors, winked at judges, laughed with fellow officers in locker rooms where racial slurs still echoed in low tones. He was meticulous, rarely leaving traces of direct violence, preferring the psychological chokehold, the humiliating searches, the gloved pat-downs in public, the smirks that followed random checks. The badge gave him cover, but his confidence came from years of watching the system reward his behavior. When he planted evidence on a teenager too scared to protest, it earned him a commendation. When he falsified a report on a homeless veteran, no one blinked. To him, it was a game of pressure and compliance. The more someone resisted, the harder he pushed. And if they happened to be black, brown, or poor, that pressure became punitive. Yet, his record remained clean, shielded by the blue wall and protected by a culture that valued results over rights. Promotions came. Awards followed. In community meetings, he smiled and spoke of public safety. But in patrol cars, he was a predator with a badge. There were whispers, of course, people who remembered the girl who vanished after an encounter with him, the father who lost his job after a false DUI, the activist who swore he was followed for weeks. But whispers die quickly when fear takes root, and fear was Henson's currency. He believed no one could touch him, not after so many years. The city needed cops like him, he told himself. Tough ones, realists, enforcers. And so he wore that belief like armor, unshaken even when internal affairs knocked on his door with questions he laughed off. His arrogance wasn't bluster, it was built on experience, and his experience had taught him that the system didn't just ignore men like him, protected them, celebrated them. For every person he harassed, there was a superior who praised his tenacity. For every false arrest, a DA who turned a blind eye in the name of law and order. The badge wasn't just protection, it was his identity, his weapon, his religion. And in his mind, it made him invincible. That illusion held, until the day he pulled over a woman who did not bow, who did not break, who did not fit into his script of silent compliance. A woman with a voice, a name, and a fire he didn't see coming. A woman who would turn the weight of the law he had long weaponized into a blade aimed at his own legacy. But that reckoning was still ahead. For now, Henson sat in his patrol car, sipping burnt coffee, smirking at the memory of his last clean bust, never suspecting that his entire world was about to shatter. It began on a humid Thursday evening, the kind where the air hung heavy and even the city lights seemed to blur into the tension of the dusk. Officer Brent Henson sat behind the wheel of his cruiser near the edge of downtown, scanning the streets not for crime, but for opportunities, those quiet moments when he could flex his authority under the veil of routine policing. That's when he saw the silver Lexus glide through the intersection, steady and well within the speed limit. Yet it was the driver that caught his eye. A black woman, alone, confident, unbothered. Something about her presence triggered his instinct. Not suspicion rooted in law or threat, but a knee-jerk authority reflex he'd honed over the years. He flipped on the lights without hesitation, pulling her over with the ease of a man who had done this hundreds of times. When she rolled down the window, her tone was calm, her hands visible, her voice steady. She introduced herself clearly. Dr. Maya Caldwell, civil rights attorney, returning from a panel on police reform. Henson's smirk flickered but didn't fade. Titles didn't impress him. In fact, they irritated him, especially when delivered without the deference he demanded. He asked for license and registration, but her questions came first. Why was she being stopped? What was the probable cause? Her eyes didn't lower, her hands didn't tremble. That alone felt like defiance. He invented a claim. She failed to signal a lane change. She contested it, politely but firmly. He repeated the charge louder, more aggressively, subtly stepping closer to the car door as if to reestablish dominance. She began to record, and that was the moment he crossed the line he'd danced around for years. He ordered her out of the vehicle, voice sharp now, tone shifting from professional to punitive. She asked if she was under arrest. He claimed she was obstructing an investigation. When she refused to exit, citing her rights, he called for backup. The situation escalated not because she was dangerous, but because he felt challenged. 2 other officers arrived, both familiar with Henson's methods and unwilling to question him on scene. With their presence solidifying his authority, he pulled open the door and dragged her out, ignoring her protests and the recording still capturing every second. She didn't resist, but he cuffed her tightly, his grip bruising, pushing her against the hood of her own car. He called in the arrest as non-compliant, disorderly conduct, painting a narrative over the radio he knew would shield him later. As she sat in the back of his cruiser, staring through the barred window, he glanced at her ID again. Dr. Maya Caldwell. He repeated the name, as if mocking the very idea that a woman like her thought credentials could save her. At the station, he delayed her phone call, manipulated the booking process, and added a charge of resisting arrest. But she didn't yell. She didn't beg. She watched, waited, memorized everything. He left that night with the same cocky air. Another troublemaker booked. Another assertion of control logged in his mental scoreboard. But something gnawed at him. She hadn't cracked. She hadn't submitted. Even as he walked past her holding cell, her eyes followed him with a kind of quiet fury he hadn't encountered before. It wasn't fear. It was purpose. By the next morning, the video she recorded had already made it online, though it was only partial. Still, it sparked enough conversation to catch the attention of the local press. When she was released, Maya didn't run to the media or hide in anger. She went to work. She filed a formal complaint, then another with the State Bar Association, then one with the Federal Civil Rights Division. She announced publicly her intent to challenge the charges and file a counterclaim against the city. The headlines shifted from "Traffic Stop Gone Wrong" to "Civil Rights Attorney Arrested by Officer with History of Complaints." Henson shrugged it off. He'd survived worse. But Maya Caldwell wasn't like the others. She didn't retreat. She didn't accept settlements or issue statements for the sake of optics. She prepared for war. And in doing so, she ignited a fire that would soon consume the very fortress of protection Henson had spent his career hiding inside. What he thought was just another arrest had become a declaration, one that would turn the weight of his badge against him in ways he never anticipated. The courthouse steps had seen countless defendants walk beneath its stone archways, but never one quite like Dr. Maya Caldwell, who entered not as a shamed arrestee seeking mercy but as a warrior cloaked in poise, intellect, and indignation sharpened into precision. Dressed in charcoal gray, her stride was measured, her expression unreadable, but her presence sent a tremor through the building that even seasoned clerks whispered about. Officer Brent Henson, meanwhile, arrived with his usual arrogance, flanked by a department lawyer and puffed up with the self-assurance of a man used to watching cases dissolve in his favor. The courtroom filled faster than expected. Journalists, law students, local activists, and a few off-duty officers curious to see the woman who dared turn the game around. Henson assumed she'd fold like so many others once inside the machine, plead out to avoid the humiliation of a drawn-out trial, maybe even offer a backdoor settlement if pressured hard enough. But when her name was called and she stood, she made no move to the defense table. She walked forward and announced, calmly and unequivocally, that she would be representing herself. A murmur swept the courtroom like a gust of wind through dry leaves. The judge raised an eyebrow, already recognizing her name from civil rights litigation and advocacy circles. She cited her credentials with the cool formality of someone used to standing on legal battlegrounds, and once approved, she turned toward Henson with a gaze so focused it felt surgical. From the opening statement, Maya dismantled the narrative he'd crafted in his report. With a quiet intensity, she highlighted inconsistencies in his language, the absence of dashcam footage, and the conveniently muted body cam during the critical moments of her arrest. She didn't rage. She calculated, each word chosen like a scalpel rather than a sword. Henson grew restless. He wasn't used to this kind of scrutiny, especially not from a black woman standing across from him, commanding the court with both elegance and fire. She submitted evidence of past complaints against him, knowing they'd be denied for formal inclusion but ensuring the press heard every word. The prosecution stumbled, unprepared for a defendant who was also a seasoned litigator and not some desperate civilian trying to avoid jail time. Each time Henson took the stand, her cross-examinations became a masterclass in unraveling authority without ever raising her voice. She would ask questions that sounded benign, but each one sliced deeper. "Officer Henson, can you clarify why your report contradicts the radio transcript? Or, is it standard procedure in your department to mislabel civil disobedience as resisting arrest?" He answered with the same smug detachment, but beads of sweat betrayed the crack in his armor. On the third day, she introduced character witnesses, professors, colleagues, a former judge, all vouching not only for her integrity but their own unease at how often similar stories were told with no recourse. Then she shifted gears, laying bare the systemic patterns that allowed officers like Henson to operate unchecked. Statistical data on racial disparities in traffic stops, city records showing the disproportionate targeting of black professionals, testimony from community members who had filed past complaints and were never heard. Every word was woven into a broader indictment, not just of Henson but of the machine that enabled him. The judge listened, at times visibly moved, at times sharply attentive, while the prosecution floundered under the weight of their collapsing case. Maya's brilliance wasn't in bombast, but in precision. She knew how to pace a narrative so that by the time the gallery realized what she had done, Henson stood exposed, not just as a liar, but as a symptom of a deeper rot. His lawyer's objections increased in desperation, but they couldn't erase the damage. One clip from her closing argument would later go viral. "This courtroom was built to protect justice, not shield injustice behind a badge. And if we cannot tell the difference, then justice has no meaning at all." The jury watched her not as a defendant, but as a mirror to their own conscience. For the first time in his career, Brent Henson felt cornered not by the law, but by the truth. What was supposed to be a simple arraignment had spiraled into a public reckoning, and even his colleagues in the back row looked away when Maya delivered her final words. She stepped down from the podium not as a victim, but as a force, leaving behind a silence so dense it felt like judgment itself had paused to breathe. Outside, reporters swarmed for comment, but Maya simply said, "Let the record speak. I'm just getting started." And indeed, the courtroom was no longer just a venue for defense. It had become her arena, and Henson, for the first time in his career, was the one on trial in every sense that mattered. The courtroom had become more than a legal battleground. It was now a crucible of reckoning, where every lie Officer Brent Henson had ever told threatened to rise from the ashes and wrap around his throat. With each new session, Dr. Maya Caldwell peeled back another layer of his carefully constructed facade, and the public watched as the man who once stood untouchable began to unravel beneath the scrutiny of truth. She began introducing subpoenas, records that showed complaint after complaint against Henson, mysteriously closed without follow-up, often marked unsubstantiated despite consistent patterns in the allegations. She uncovered one internal affairs investigation that had been shuttered due to a lack of cooperation, only to reveal that the supposed lack was based on a complainant who had been deported just days after filing. One by one, she tracked down witnesses who had been silenced. Men and women from poor neighborhoods, some with minor records, others with none at all of whom had stories that echoed her own. Stops without cause, cuffs without reason, humiliation without consequence. The judge, once skeptical of her broader claims, now leaned forward more often than back, his expression tightening each time Maya revealed another failure of oversight or another hole in Henson's account. She exposed body cam logs that were regularly deactivated within minutes of traffic stops, an alleged battery failure that always seemed to occur when Henson was alone. She presented footage from a bystander in a separate case showing Henson cursing at a young black man, shoving him to the ground while the official report claimed verbal cooperation and peaceful detainment. She brought up old police union arbitration documents that reversed his suspension from an incident in 2018, where a woman filed a harassment complaint and was later arrested on unrelated charges weeks after. The courtroom gasped when Maya presented a photograph, grainy, black and white, from a diner security cam, showing Henson meeting with a known private investigator hired by the city to dig into her personal life after her arrest. When questioned, Henson fumbled for the first time, claiming it was a coincidence, a chance encounter. Maya didn't even raise her voice. She simply said, "You don't follow justice, officer. You stalk it." The trial had now become a national headline, picked up by news outlets across the country. Civil rights leaders began attending, sitting behind Maya in quiet solidarity, their presence a reminder that she did not stand alone. Protesters rallied outside the courthouse, chanting her name alongside those of others who never got their day in court. Maya, ever composed, never once stepped out of her role as legal counsel, but every sentence she spoke in court echoed far beyond its walls. She introduced a retired officer, an anonymous whistleblower who had served with Henson years ago, who testified behind a screen, revealing how complaints were routinely buried to protect rising stars in the department. Under cross-examination, the whistleblower admitted he stayed silent out of fear and guilt. "But not today," he said, voice cracking. "Today I tell the truth because she's doing what I never could." Henson's lawyer grew increasingly hostile, objecting to everything, but each objection only underscored how much Maya had cornered them. She showed how Henson's arrest quotas spiked before city budget reviews, how he made a disproportionate number of stops near low-income housing, and how nearly all of those arrested were people of color. The final blow came when she called a data analyst who compiled a report showing that over a 5-year span, Henson had conducted over 1,100 stops, 92% of which involved Black or Latino drivers, despite those groups comprising only 37% of the population in his district. The numbers were damning, irrefutable, laid out in graphs and timelines that made patterns impossible to deny. The jury watched, silent and grim, as Maya closed the file and said, "This is not policing. This is profiling masked as procedure. And you, Officer Henson, are not the exception. You are the design." Henson, who had smirked through earlier proceedings, now sat pale and still, his once proud uniform now a symbol of something corroded and exposed. Internal Affairs opened a renewed investigation, spurred not by departmental integrity, but by public pressure so immense it could no longer be ignored. City council members were called to account. Journalists dug deeper. A second civil suit was filed by a woman who had watched Maya's testimony and recognized the same officer who once detained her for walking through her own neighborhood after dusk. Maya's trial had started as a defense, but now it was an excavation of a system built to protect predators, of a culture that enabled silence, of a man who believed himself a guardian but was in truth a gatekeeper of fear. Every new revelation cracked the foundation Henson had stood on, and the courtroom, once a cage for Maya, became the forge where his illusion of power was melted down under the heat of her precision. When the court recessed that day, the air was electric, charged with the knowledge that something seismic had shifted. Justice wasn't just being sought, it was being rebuilt, brick by brick, in the place where lies had once stood unchallenged. And Maya Caldwell, calm and relentless, stood at the center of it all. Not as a survivor, but as the storm that refused to pass. The reckoning did not arrive as a thunderclap but rather as a slow, methodical dismantling, each blow striking with the force of truth and the rhythm of inevitability, leaving Officer Brent Henson exposed in a way he had never imagined possible. The courtroom trial had become a cultural flashpoint, but its consequences stretched far beyond its walls. seeping into the foundations of the city's law enforcement apparatus like water through cracked stone. As the evidence mounted and Maya Caldwell's case became impossible to dismiss as isolated or coincidental, public outcry reached a boiling point. Local news stations ran nightly segments dissecting each revelation. Op-eds flooded the newspapers demanding systemic change, and social media erupted with calls for justice. Not just for Maya, but for everyone who had suffered under officers like Henson. His allies, once eager to sing his praises and shield his misconduct behind the sanctity of the badge, began to retreat, their silence louder than their past endorsements. The police union, sensing the shift in momentum, released a cautious statement affirming their commitment to accountability, a move that many interpreted as the first crack in the blue wall. Internal Affairs, previously content to operate as a rubber stamp for the department's decisions, reopened multiple cold complaints involving Henson, this time under the oversight of a state-appointed review board. Officers who once joked in locker rooms about how Henson handles business suddenly scrubbed their social media, deleted old texts, and distanced themselves from the man they had once considered untouchable. Henson, ever defiant, tried to go on the offensive, appearing on a local talk radio show where he framed himself as the victim of anti-police hysteria. But his words rang hollow against the tide of documented abuse and cold, hard numbers. In a surprise move, the district attorney's office announced it would no longer pursue the charges against Maya Caldwell, citing significant procedural inconsistencies and a potential violation of constitutional rights. But Maya didn't stop there. She filed a civil lawsuit not only against Henson, but the department, the city, and the chain of command that had enabled him. Her lawsuit named supervisors who had buried complaints, lieutenants who had signed off on false reports, and the legal advisors who had recommended non-disclosure settlements to silence victims. Depositions began to unearth more damning revelations, including an internal memo from 3 years prior warning that Henson's aggressive tactics could become a liability for the department. That memo had been ignored. Now it was front-page news. One of Henson's former partners agreed to testify in exchange for immunity, describing a culture of intimidation and manipulation, where officers were rewarded for arrest stats and discouraged from questioning unethical behavior. The walls were closing in. Protesters marched to City Hall daily, demanding resignations, and an independent task force was launched by the state attorney general's office to investigate the city's police practices over the last decade. Henson, suspended without pay, found himself the subject of 2 criminal investigations, one for misconduct in office and another for perjury. When subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury, his lawyer filed for a postponement, citing mental health concerns, a phrase that drew skepticism and scorn from a public no longer willing to entertain his excuses. In his own neighborhood, once filled with friendly nods and neighborly respect, he found himself isolated, windows shuttered as he passed, mail left unopened for days. Even his family began to feel the weight of his unraveling, as relatives faced harassment, online threats, and the shame of association. Meanwhile, Maya's visibility only grew. Her measured, incisive interviews broadcast nationwide as she spoke not with vengeance but with vision, outlining concrete reforms and championing legislative efforts to curtail qualified immunity and strengthen oversight boards. Civil rights organizations rallied behind her, and within weeks, she announced the formation of the Caldwell Foundation, a nonprofit aimed at providing legal support for victims of police misconduct and advocating for systemic reform across jurisdictions. Donations poured in, endorsements followed, and her voice became one of the most respected in the growing national conversation about law enforcement accountability. Brent Henson, once the face of power in a uniform, became a symbol of everything the public was finally ready to confront. His name, once spoken with authority, now echoed with disgrace. The city council held emergency meetings to discuss restructuring the police oversight committee, while the mayor, facing re-election, proposed a sweeping reform bill nicknamed Maya's Law, aimed at increasing transparency, banning certain arrest practices, and requiring that all body cams remain active throughout public encounters. When Henson was formally charged with multiple counts of civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and falsification of public records, he didn't walk into the courthouse as he once had. There were no cameras, no press conferences, no smirk on his face. only the weight of consequence hanging heavy over him like a sentence already passed. The courtroom, once his stage of silent dominance, now felt cold and unfamiliar, lined with faces he once dismissed, now empowered by the storm he had unwittingly summoned. And though his trial had yet to begin, the true verdict had already been rendered by a city awakened, a community emboldened, and a woman who refused to be broken. The fall of Brent Henson was more than a headline. It was a cultural reckoning, a seismic rupture in the bedrock of institutional immunity, and the echo of that collapse reverberated through the city long after the gavel came down. The criminal trial that followed the civil litigation was not the chaotic circus many had expected, but a somber, methodical exposition of the rot that had festered beneath a polished badge for over a decade. Henson entered court now in a suit, not a uniform, the emblem of his authority stripped from his chest and replaced with a defendant placard that felt almost surreal to those who had once feared him. Testimony after testimony brought forward by the prosecution read like a ledger of grief. Men and women, young and old, who had been pulled from cars, pushed to the pavement, humiliated and then forgotten. The courtroom, once a place where Henson had been greeted with nods of deference, now sat heavy with judgment, its silence more damning than any prosecutor's words. Former colleagues took the stand, their eyes darting nervously, their voices low, admitting complicity through omission, silence, or fear. Department heads, under subpoena, squirmed beneath questions they could no longer dodge. Why were warnings ignored? Why was accountability so easily deferred? Why did it take a public trial to acknowledge a problem that had lived in their records for years? Henson's defense tried to lean on protocol, on the ambiguities of perception, on the chaos of street-level law enforcement, but none of it held against the tidal wave of evidence, most of which had been made possible by Maya Caldwell's unrelenting pursuit of transparency. Maya herself testified again, but not with the same fire from her trial. This time she stood as a witness, a plaintiff turned public guardian, her words less about herself and more about every person who had never gotten their day in court. She spoke of systems, not just individuals, of patterns, not just moments. Her testimony was calm, clinical even, but the weight of it was unbearable for Henson, who refused to meet her eyes the entire time. When the jury found him guilty on multiple counts, civil rights violations, falsifying evidence, obstruction, and unlawful detention, the courtroom did not erupt in cheers, only a collective exhale, as if justice had been holding its breath for years. Sentencing was swift and severe, with the judge delivering a scathing rebuke of not just Henson, but the culture that allowed him to thrive. Henson was stripped of his pension, sentenced to serve time in federal prison, and barred from ever working in law enforcement again. His mugshot circulated across news channels as the visual embodiment of accountability, while Maya's image appeared beside headlines reading, "A New Chapter in Justice Reform." But it wasn't only about punishment, it was about transformation. Maya's foundation launched a new initiative, partnering with universities and civil rights organizations to create a database that tracked misconduct claims against public officials, making records accessible and difficult to bury. She met with state legislators, helping draft a bill that mandated independent investigations into all officer-involved civilian complaints, and she refused to let her case become an anomaly. Schools invited her to speak, law conferences requested her presence, and community groups held forums using her case as both a warning and a blueprint. The story reached beyond state lines, inspiring similar efforts in cities grappling with their own demons. Victims previously too afraid to speak began coming forward, and in Maya's presence, many found the courage to name their pain aloud. Meanwhile, Henson adjusted to life behind bars, a reality far removed from the power and control he once held. Inside, he was just another inmate, no longer shielded by a uniform or a system. His appeals were filed and quickly denied, his public defenders unable to find flaws in a case constructed on the foundation of undeniable truth. The man who once stood tall in courtrooms now sat hunched in visitation rooms, avoiding cameras, dodging reporters, and haunted by the very fear he once imposed on others. But Maya never gloated. She never celebrated his downfall as a personal victory, because it wasn't about him, it was about what he represented, and more importantly, what she refused to allow to continue. She told audiences, "We didn't win because he was convicted. We won because people stopped pretending the system wasn't broken. Her words became the cornerstone of a broader movement, one fueled not by vengeance, but by vision. The city, still healing, passed Maya's law unanimously, and neighboring jurisdictions began drafting similar versions. Police academy training was overhauled, with entire modules now focused on civil liberties, community engagement, and implicit bias. For every angry email she received 10 more from people thanking her for her strength. For every whisper of resentment from those still clinging to the old guard, there were shouts of support from a new generation ready to rebuild. Maya had turned a courtroom into a revolution and made justice something tangible, not theoretical. And while Henson faded into obscurity, Maya Caldwell emerged as one of the most consequential civil rights figures of her time. Not because she sought the spotlight, but because she refused to be silenced. Her story became a living testament to what happens when courage confronts corruption, when law is wielded by the people it was meant to protect, and when one woman decides enough is not only enough, but far from the end.